Seton Hall has a long tradition of building bridges. We have Monsignor Osterreicher, founder of the Judeo-Christian Institute. He published many volumes called The Bridge. So the bridge is a beautiful idea of bringing people together and connecting people who wouldn't ordinarily speak to one another. So today we're delighted to have Father Tom Michel here with us. There's many, this is sponsored by the Center for Catholic Studies. We have many brochures and flyers here of upcoming events. So I'll just mention a couple of them. On April 23rd, there'll be Professor Andrea Bartoli from George Mason University will be speaking on conflict resolution, the experience of peacemaking. So that also, the idea of linking people together who would not ordinarily perhaps even speak to one another. So to introduce Father Tom Michel, I'm delighted to have Othar Mortuza, Professor of Finance in the School of Business, to do our introduction today. Thanks.
Yes, I just came from a meeting where I was referred to almost like a subversive business faculty member. So, but I think if you just look at the news headline and media, there is a great need to know what exactly are Muslim or who they are. And even though the two faiths have been around for centuries and so on, but the knowledge that they had seems always to be in need of, improvement, let's put it that way. I think a few months ago I was reading a book and I found out that neither Ghazali nor Aquinas had read the scripture of other faiths. And in 16th century, when Emperor Akbar in India invited some Jesuit missionaries from Goa, Portuguese colony, they were amazed to see paintings in the emperor's palace that were adoring Mary and Jesus. And one of the missionary commented that he felt like he was in the palace of the Roman emperor. And when I read that in actually a review of exhibition that was held a few years ago in Metropolitan Museum, Venice and her Islamic neighbor. And what was noticeable for me was here the Portuguese who lived next to Muslim for 700 years. You would have expected them to know that adoration of Mary and Jesus is intrinsic to Islam, that without adoring that, one can't be a Muslim. So, to see that kind of awareness, I think, is what we need bridges for today, even more so because we have just gone into a war that has bankrupted our nation based on these misperceptions. So because of that, I feel I'll let Father Michel talk about it. So it's a great privilege for me to be part of this ceremony, and welcome.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at Seton Hall University today and to share with you some of the things that I've learned during the many years that I have lived and worked with Muslims. I should probably begin by telling you something about who I am and what I've been doing. I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a Jesuit. And I've just begun working at the Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown University. I just came last month. Before then, I was living in Turkey. But for the past 40 years or so, I've spent my time involved with Muslims. About half the time, I teach Islamic studies in Christian or in secular universities. And the other half the time, I teach Christian theology in Islamic institutions. I've often lived in cities and towns in Turkey and Indonesia and Iran, Kyrgyzstan, Libya, where I was the only Christian. And I taught Muslim students for whom I was the first Christian they ever met. Now, it was at the suggestion of Muslims that I got into this life's work. I was ordained a priest in 1967, and at that time the Second Vatican Council had just ended, and while he was in Rome, my bishop, who at that time was Cardinal Ritter, he met a bishop from Indonesia who asked him to send a priest to teach English in the seminary and in a teacher's college there. So I went to Indonesia, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it, and I wanted to stay. And so I wrote back to my bishop, asked if I could stay. He said, well, it'd be better if you join a religious order, because he didn't want one of his priests, I guess, halfway around the world. And so the people who were working in the part of Indonesia where I was were Jesuits. So I did my novitiate in Indonesia, and I'm, until today, a member of the Indonesian province of the Jesuits. Well, once I took my vows, my provincial said to me, ask around and see what you'll be doing here. See what the needs are of society. See how you might be able to fit into what we're doing. And so I started asking people who had different positions of responsibility. And I also talked to my students. Now, my students, about half of them were Muslim. Many were Christian, and there were a handful of Hindus and Buddhists. And some of the Muslim students had an idea. They said, why don't you study Islam? That way you can help Christians and others to come to a better understanding of Islam, and you can help Muslims to come to know more about Christian faith. Well, I really liked the idea, and I can remember going back to my room, I started thinking, and somebody's got their cell phone on. Okay, I went back to my room, and I started thinking in the next days and weeks and praying about this. I got my copy of the Second Vatican Council documents out. It was brand new then. The council was only over about 4 years. And I read the passage on Nostra Aetate, it's called, on other religions. I read the passage on Islam. And 3 phrases struck me at the time and have stayed with me in the years since, and really kind of shaped the way I've lived, really. The first one was the first statement. It says, the church has great esteem for Muslims. I thought, we do? I didn't have anything against Muslims. I didn't know any Muslims till I went to Indonesia, and the ones I met in Indonesia were very likable people, but I didn't know we were supposed to esteem Muslims, or why. And I had my first clue as to what my life direction was going to take. I was going to find out the reasons for this esteem that we should have for Muslims, and I was going to find out the way to communicate this esteem to others. And the second phrase struck me. Muslims worship with us the one God. I never adverted to the implications of our worshiping together the one God. How can we be rivals or enemies when we're all trying to serve the same God? But it was the final words of the council statement that have had the most concrete effect on my life. Acknowledging that down through the centuries there have been many conflicts between Christians and Muslims, the document goes on, and I'm quoting it, we urge all to move beyond the past, to work together for the good of all, for peace, social justice, moral values, and freedom. Here the implications are even more sweeping. The Council envisions nothing less than a common task in our world for Muslims and Christians to work together for the common good in 4 key areas of modern life: to build peace, to establish justice in our societies, to defend moral values, and to work for true human freedom. Well, this was a project that I wanted to be part of, and pretty well describes what I've been involved in for the past 40 or so years. My life has been rather unusual for a Catholic priest in that I've spent most of my time in dialogue with Muslims, sharing life with them, and reflecting upon our relations as 2 communities of faith standing before the one God. And the most basic thing that I've learned over these years is that Islam is a faith, a way of living before God, a way of responding to the daily demands of the Creator. We will never understand Muslims and what is happening in the Muslim world unless we realize that for Muslims, God stands at the center. God is the driving force of all that occurs. Whatever constructs we come up with about Islam as a civilization, a sociological phenomenon, a cultural tradition, an historical movement, or a geopolitical force, they will all miss the mark and not address Muslim self-identity and self-understanding if we forget their commitment to God as the center of human life and the formative core of human community. Like me, I think that many of you watched the protests unfold in Egypt last year. Back in the 70s, when I was studying Arabic in Cairo, I used to live a block away from Tahrir Square, our Liberation Square, but the building has since been torn down to widen the road. But what struck me as I watched the live coverage on Al Jazeera television was how at noontime and mid-afternoon, at the call to prayer, these tens of thousands of protesters, without discussion or fuss, or trying to make a statement, silently formed lines across the square, faced Mecca, and worshiped God. The police, who were patrolling the square to maintain order, lined up side by side with the protesters and performed the prayer. Afterwards, the protesters stood up and resumed their claim to their democratic rights. But they were aware of their obligations to God, even in the midst of their calls for dignity and justice. Now, in saying this, I can't pretend that there are not serious problems and real challenges to our living together. The worldwide Muslim community has, like its Christian counterpart, and in fact all human communities, its hypocrites, its cultural adherents, and its miscreants. It has its share of those who are motivated by anger and resentment. It has those who believe that they and they only possess truth and that others are in error. What religious community, including our own, does not have such people? Moreover, I'm aware that many of the grievances that Muslims feel towards Christians, towards Western nations, and our own nation are justified. Resentment doesn't arise out of nothing. It comes from people feeling that they have been wronged, that others have imposed their will on them and treated their most sacred beliefs with disrespect. So if we Christians, as Christians, feel that Muslims are the problem and don't realize equally that we are the problem, then real harmony and understanding will never be achieved. I've also learned over the years that not everyone wants interfaith harmony. Some Muslims, like some Christians, are violent, and some of them offer religious justification for violence. We should be careful not to exaggerate, though. In real life, those who support and follow the path of violence are extremely few. Still, I have Christian friends who were proponents of dialogue who were killed. I have some very good friends who were killed. But at the same time, I acknowledge the heroism of a 26-year-old Muslim stock clerk, the father of two, who died removing a bomb from a Christian church in Indonesia, where thousands of Muslims in his Islamic youth organization had committed themselves to protecting Christian places of worship. This was in 1998 at Christmas time. Somebody put a bomb threat, said there's going to be a bomb in a Christian church at midnight. This, of course, was to deter Christians from going to church or to frighten them. So the Muslim youth organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, they said, we will protect the churches and we'll do two things. We'll sweep the churches and make sure there's no bombs, and also we'll form a human cordon around each of the churches and only allow in the Christians who are going to worship. And one of them in the youth organization was this young stock clerk, and he found a bomb. He found the only bomb, actually, that there was, and he carried it gingerly out of the church and was depositing it in the ditch at the end of the parking lot, and it went off. And he was the only victim of violence that Christmas. Another time, when I was teaching in the southern Philippines, rebels came armed with submachine guns. They came to the back of the classroom and they said, we want this foreigner to go with us. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? But there was a Muslim woman in the class, middle-aged woman. She turned around and she was talking to them in Maranao. I couldn't understand it in her language, their language, and they all kind of sheepishly backed out and left. And afterwards, I said to her, I said, what did you say to them that they all left? She said, I told them this was education. This was something serious, and they should go back to where they came from. And they did. So I'm very grateful to her. What's my point? My point is that in the world we live in, violence and heroism, peacemakers and villains, saints and troublemakers are all part of the terrain. And in this, Muslims are no different from anyone else. But I have to say that the vast majority of Muslims whom I've known and lived with over the past 40 years, the literally thousands of people in many countries, really tens of thousands, with whom I've worked and debated and eaten and laughed, they profess Islam as a religion of peace. And they welcomed me, an American Christian priest, with hospitality, warmth, and I'm not exaggerating, with love. Their lives from birth to death, and those of their children and grandchildren, are peaceful and untouched by violence. These are the people who've borne witness to me that Islam is a religion of peace. But let me explain what I mean. I said that I've been involved in dialogue with Muslims for the last 40 years. What do I mean by the term dialogue? It can sometimes give the wrong impression of what we're about. Dialogue can kind of conjure up a party, a coffee and cookies with Rabbi X and Cardinal Y and Imam Z, all sitting down to make small talk, all nervously trying to avoid any issues or comments that might explode in their faces. Or at a more academic level, we can imagine dialogue as an interfaith collection of intellectuals, university professors, columnists, politicians, discussing the affairs of the day. Now, these are definitely types of dialogue, and they do have a long-term value that I will discuss later. but they're somewhat rarefied types of encounter and don't affect many people or make real changes in society. By contrast, I'll offer this example that I've taken from the southern Philippines of a different kind of dialogue that we promoted in Asia. Mucard. Mucard is Mucaard, and it's an acronym meaning Muslim Christian Action for Advocacy, Relief, and Development. It's an umbrella organization made up of mosque and church-based associations in more than 120 villages of the southern Philippines. It's been operating quietly and effectively since 1984. So this is almost 30 years now. In each village, the interreligious committee operates independently. They choose their projects according to the local needs. Muslims and Christians came together after the violence that occurred in the 1970s, and they intuited that by working together for the benefit of everyone, they could also overcome ethnic and religious suspicion and strife. In the beginning, they began with simple, obvious projects: all-weather roads, pickup trucks to take fish to market, seminars to teach crop rotation and introduce new types of seed and animal species, daycare centers for working mothers, income generation projects for village women. But over the years, their approach has become more sophisticated, with projects for combating climate change, providing safe water supplies, developing integrated agroforestry, and microfinance for small, medium-sized enterprises, all the while promoting peace and harmony between the diverse communities. It's important, I think, for us to note that Mucard is not just another rural development agency. It's an organization consciously rooted in the mosques and the churches, in worship of God, promoted in Friday and Sunday sermons, carried forward in lectures and workshops about each other's religions, moments of joint fellowship, and common celebration of religious and national feasts. Now, Mucard is just one of the many examples I could have chosen. If we'd had a week, I could give you another 25 examples. It's a rural-based organization of agricultural and fishing villages, but it has its urban counterparts, where Muslims and Christians work together to respond to the needs of squatters, slum dwellers, day laborers. They run schools together for children on very small islands where there is no school. Christians and Muslims work, the Filipino dialogue that I've mentioned, dialogue movement, it has its counterparts elsewhere. In Indonesia, for example, people were shocked at the communal violence that took place in some parts of the country during the 1990s, after which many came together in efforts at prevention to build and reinforce harmony before any new outbreak of hostilities could occur. A recently published directory lists over 300 distinct dialogue associations in Indonesia, which are aimed variously at reconciliation, communal harmony, and social service on an explicitly religious basis. Last January, a year ago, I was in Jombang in Indonesia's East Java with a group of Muslims and Christians on the occasion of the Chinese Lunar New Year. We paid a friendly visit together to the Chinese temple and shared a meal with Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist neighbors. The Chinese, I discovered, are equally welcome at the churches, mosques, and churches. The religious communities of Jombang have appealed to the government to have Jombang declared officially City of Harmony. I mentioned before that there is a particular role that religious leaders can play in peacemaking and in peace building. In such diverse countries as Sierra Leone in West Africa, or Indonesia and the Philippines in Southeast Asia, it was the religious leaders who were able to broker a peace agreement in situations of conflict and civil war. The religious leaders, well, for one thing, they have the social mobility to bring together the views and concerns of all parties to establish and maintain a peace agreement. A typical day might include a breakfast meeting with farmers or factory workers, lunch at a women's cooperative, and dinner with government ministers or military leaders. Who else has such social mobility? The religious leaders also are often closer to the preoccupations of common people than our government officials or army officers, and they're more trusted as spokespersons who will faithfully represent the concerns of those in the community. However, it's possible for the religious leaders to act together as effective builders of peace only when they already know and trust each other. They could only do it if they know each other. If they're as suspicious as everybody else, they're useless as people bringing about reconciliation. And this is what's done through dialogue meetings, luncheons. Here the coffee and cookies even have a function. It's bringing people together, getting them to know each other, getting them to trust each other. For example, in the Philippines, the Bishops' Ulama Conference, made up of Catholic and Protestant church leaders and members of the Council of Muslim Ulama and Imams, has been the single most effective association for maintaining the peace in Mindanao. They meet every 2 weeks, and they've been doing this now for 13 years. They meet and they have been studying and reflecting on the needs of the region, representing their concerns with a common voice to the central government. They've been studying the economy, they've been studying ecological issues, they've been studying religious issues, they've been studying employment and education and problems of youth, and representing this together to the government in Manila. Well, so far, most of my examples have been taken from Southeast Asia, where I spent most of my life in the 1980s and 1990s. But in the time remaining, I want to turn my attention to the country where I was living until recently, that is, Turkey. In the 1980s, I was working in the Vatican. I was in charge of Muslim-Christian relations. And I think it was 1985, Pope John Paul received a request from the rector of Ankara University in Turkey. And he asked the Pope to send them a professor of Christian theology. Well, the Pope, of course, doesn't answer all the letters personally that he gets. He gets too many. So that he sends them to the proper office, and somebody prepares a response. So basically, the letter came to my office. I was in charge of the Office for Islam. And they said, find somebody to go to Turkey. And it was the 1980s, and it was still a new thing, and it was kind of hard to get people. Somebody said, I got tenure, I can't get away, and somebody else said, I can't leave my family at this time, and somebody else said, I'm not prepared. Anyway, we couldn't find anybody. So we had a meeting in the Vatican, and we were saying, here we keep talking about dialogue, and here there's a group of people who invite us, and we can't find anybody to go. So to make the long story short, rather than say no to the people in Turkey, I went to Turkey and taught there for a year in 1986. And it was really good experience for me, and I think for them, because they invited me back to another university in 87, another one in 88, and so on. And I could have been doing that pretty much full time. Except in the Vatican, they said, well, here we have one of our officials, and he's spending all his time in Turkey. So they asked the Jesuits to start sending other people to Turkey. So I went less and less, but I've been there almost every year now for the past 25 years. And what I do there is give courses in Christian theology See, in Turkey, they have 23 theology faculties, all of which are connected with state universities. And this is a 4-year program with 1 year propedeutic year studying Arabic, and then they have 4 years after that. And in that is a course on history of religions. So you have a module on Judaism, and then one on Christianity, one on the other religions. So when I teach in Turkey, I usually teach the one obviously on Christian theology, an introduction to Christian theology. And it's really been a good experience. As I say, it's been an opportunity for me to live as a Christian in totally among Muslims. And you learn many things this way. I can remember the whole approach to death. I was teaching in Izmir, ancient Smyrna, on the coast, when my teaching assistant, he invited me over to his house one evening, and he said, my grandfather's dying. And so I went over to the house, and there's a big bedroom, and the grandfather is over in one corner of the bedroom in his bed. He's dying. And the family is over on the other side. They're quietly drinking tea and greeting each other. There, people come in, people go out. But always there were maybe 2 or 3 people, sometimes the grandmother, sometimes one of the grown sons or daughters, grandchild, always next to the grandfather's bed. And they were saying over and over with the grandfather, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger. And they would repeat that, and they repeat it over and over. And even when the grandfather fell asleep, as he did, they kept on doing it. And then somebody would leave, and somebody come in to greet a newcomer, but somebody'd always take their place and keep on, even in the grandfather's name, repeating this profession of faith. And so during the night, the grandfather died. Well, this was a beautiful thing, a beautiful way to approach death. There was no fear, there was no anxiety, there was just people in full confidence that God was going to receive the grandfather and take him. So I had a chance to learn a lot of these kind of inside daily things from Muslims. But as time went on, more and more Muslims really liked the idea of having a Christian among them. Different groups would invite me. And they weren't interested in American foreign policy or anything like that. They wanted to know, well, how do you pray, and when do you pray, and who is God to you? And when I would tell them what it meant for me to be a Christian, they were never turned off or angry or upset, because they were just as eager to tell me what it meant for them to be a Muslim. And we spent so many evenings this way, and I really felt this was something good. It struck me as like the story of the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus, when they're talking about all the things that occurred in their faith, and they said, weren't our hearts burning within us? I've had that experience many times when, with Muslims, we discuss our faith together. I'm really convinced it's a good thing. Now, many of the Muslims in Turkey and elsewhere, they will kind of live out their faith in a kind of a joint spirituality, communal spirituality, what we might call Jamaat. And I got to know several of these Jamaats very well. There's a great influential man in Turkey named Seton. And he was a wonderful person. Back already 100 years ago, he said, Muslims and Christians have to be united in bearing witness to the values of God in our world. Already long time, 50 years before the Second Vatican Council was talking about this. He said the days of the jihad of the sword are over. He said if Muslims want to convince anybody, they have to do the jihad of the pen or of the word. They have to try to persuade people. They have to try to convince people. And he applied the principle of attraction. He says Muslims have to live in a way that's attractive so that other people will see that this is a good way to live. So I really, over the years, I've read more and more of his writings. He wrote a 6,000-page commentary on the Quran. And so as far as my scholarly work, a lot of it's been involved in this. He had an idea that who are the enemies of Muslims? He says it's not this group of people or that group of people. He said the real enemies of Muslims are three: ignorance, poverty, and disunity. We're not united. And that Muslims have a mission in this world with Christians of trying to work to fight ignorance, poverty, and disunity. Well, there's another group that you probably might have heard of. I think they're having a program here tomorrow, somebody told me. One of the disciples of Seton was a man named Fethullah Gülen, who's living now nearby near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I think they're having a program on campus tomorrow, although I won't unfortunately be here. He said, what we need is, Sayyid Nursi's right, these are the enemies, but what we need are institutions to fight these enemies. So they started schools everywhere, and they have a big welfare program. Last year during Ramadan, they fed almost 500,000 people. And they moved from relief into development, and they have programs of especially working to provide clean water, healthy water in Somalia and the Darfur region of Sudan and Niger and the Sahel that has always endemic water problems. So, with these and other communities of good Muslims, how much time do I have left?
As much as you need.
Oh, well, I'll try to finish up 10 minutes, okay? With these and other communities of good Muslims, I find dialogue and cooperation is natural. I don't feel like I'm having to convince anybody of anything. They are already convinced because of their teachers, because of their own reflections, because of their of what Islam means to them. Now, I found it enriching and rewarding to live in Turkey and engage in the sharing of life with the followers of Islam. And I believe that, and I believe this sincerely, through my interaction with Muslims over the past 4 decades, I believe that God has made me into a better person, a better Christian, a better priest. When I lecture to groups in the West, people will sometimes object. And people say to me, maybe you're thinking this yourselves, they say, when you talk about Muslims, it's all very positive, and we feel we wouldn't have any problem living with such people. But not all Muslims are like this. Some are dangerous and violent. I hear this very often. And that, of course, is true. They have a point. But I should mention that when I give talks in predominantly Muslim countries or teach in Turkey, students and others in the audience will just as often say, well, what you've presented about Christianity is very good and attractive, but our experience of living in a world controlled by Christians is different. What we see is greed and domination and oppression. What we read about is Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and people burning the Quran. And I think that there's a basic truth here. Problems arise not from good people, but from those who are violent and intolerant. But when we want to understand what another religion is about, we have to look not at the hypocrites and the wrongdoers, but we have to look at those who have allowed themselves to be transformed by the values and counsels of their faith so that what is best in each individual can come to the fore. A couple months ago, just before I left Ankara, actually the last Sunday I was in the parish, I met an elderly Iraqi refugee, and we have many there. His wife had just died of cancer. 2 months before, he lost 2 sons in a bomb blast in Baghdad. Now he only has 1 daughter left. I was offering him my condolences, and he responded, "Whatever God sends us is good." Now, do you think he was Muslim or Christian? I won't tell you, because I don't think it makes any difference. He was a man whose faith in God was not shaken even by the most bitter of experiences. And so now I will conclude with a reference to the contemporary context of Muslim-Christian encounter and what is shaping up to be the great debate of our time. And it's one in which the followers of Islam and Christianity actually find themselves on the same side of the table. I was reading The Grand Design by the prominent scientist Stephen Hawking. In his book, Hawking makes some startling claims about the universe. He says that given the operations of quantum physics and the law of gravity, the universe can and did create itself without the need for, and I quote him, intervention of some supernatural being or God. Hawking holds that the laws of nature determine both the future and the past, he says, and do not permit temporary suspension by a divine being in the form of miracles or answers to prayers. Still further, Hawking affirms, and I quote him again, "It seems that we are no more than biological machines, and that free will is just an illusion caused by our failure to understand the complex interaction of physical laws." Now, Hawking is not a God basher playing the village atheist. He's a serious scientist, simply attempting to describe our universe in accord with the results of scientific research and mathematical formulae. However, the consequences of his theories are that humans are simply cogs in a godless, soulless machine with an automatic on-off switch that is proceeding inexorably from the last Big Bang towards the far-off next big crunch, and then after that, who knows? Well, my point is that as more and more people abandon religion and belief in God as ideas incompatible with scientific thought, Muslims and Christians must realize how much greater is what they share than the elements of dogma that divide them. Science is autonomous in its methodology and logic, but the question remains, is there anything outside the universe? Is there something or someone that is not scientifically measurable? And to this, the great question of our age, Muslims and Christians, with surprising unanimity, affirm the existence of a good and loving God who has produced the world as a thing of beauty, who has destined humans for eternal happiness, who has taught people to live according to ethical norms. This religious belief is our common Abrahamic heritage, uniting Christians and Muslims, as well as Jews, in a vision of a very different type of universe, one that is, I believe, both warmer and more hopeful than the rather chilly mechanism of scientific theory. But Muslims and Christians cannot give credible witness to this religious vision of life unless they are united in mutual respect and appreciation. if they feel that they must fight out every disagreement and seek to dominate the other economically, politically, and intellectually, their jointly held view of the universe as the product of a merciful, compassionate God will be dismissed as divisive, belligerent ideology that human society is better off without. In other words, in working to build harmony between the two communities, our very credibility is at stake. The message that we see as giving direction to our lives can only respond to the spiritual needs of the people of our time if it is a message of peace. This conviction that has motivated my work for the past 40 years has not dimmed with time, but is, if anything, stronger today than before. I can only believe in a God whose love and mercy and forgiveness are not limited to any group of people or any exclusive community of believers. Naturally, there are matters on which we disagree. We must not ignore them or sweep them away, but they need not be grounds for enmity. In this context, I remember the words of the Quran. The Quran says, "To God you are all returning. At that time, you will be informed of those things about which you disagreed." We don't have to find out these questions here and now, because one day, and this is my deepest hope, one day the truth will become clear to us all. Thank you.